Dave had always been the kind of guy who believed in keeping the peace. After 23 years of living in cramped city apartments with paper-thin walls and neighbors who played music until 3 in the morning, he finally saved enough money to buy his dream house. It wasn't a mansion by any means, but it was his. A cozy 3-bedroom home with a big backyard that backed up to the local golf course. The house came with almost an acre of land, which was more space than Dave had ever owned in his entire life. He spent his first few months just walking around his property, planning where he'd plant a garden, maybe build a deck, and definitely construct a proper storage shed. The previous owners had left behind a rusty old shed that looked like it might collapse in the next strong wind, so Dave made building a new one his first major project. He spent 3 weekends researching shed designs, visiting the hardware store, more times than he cared to count, and carefully measuring out the perfect spot near his back fence. The location was ideal, close enough to the house to be convenient but far enough away that any noise from his lawnmower or leaf blower wouldn't bother anyone. Plus, it was right near the property line with the golf course, so he figured he'd get some nice views while working on his yard equipment. Dave wasn't exactly a master carpenter, but he was determined to do things right. He watched countless YouTube videos, called his brother-in-law for advice at least a dozen times, and took his time with every step. When he finally finished the shed 2 months later, he was genuinely proud of his work. It had proper ventilation, good lighting, and he'd even splurged on having an electrician install a weatherproof outlet on the outside wall. That outlet cost him an extra $300, but Dave figured it would be worth it for plugging in his electric hedge trimmer, pressure washer, and other tools without having to run extension cords all the way from the house. The neighborhood itself was exactly what Dave had been hoping for when he decided to leave city life behind. Most of his neighbors were friendly folks who waved when they saw each other, helped bring in garbage cans when someone was out of town, and generally minded their own business. There was old Mr. Peterson next door who grew the most amazing tomatoes Dave had ever seen. The young couple across the street who always kept their yard looking like something out of a magazine, and various other neighbors who seemed like decent, normal people. For the first 8 months, Dave's life felt almost too good to be true. He'd wake up to birds chirping instead of car horns honking. He could sit on his back porch with his morning coffee and watch golfers make their way across the course behind his house. His commute to work was actually shorter than it had been in the city, and his mortgage payment was less than what he'd been paying for that cramped apartment. Dave started to think he'd finally figured out this whole adult life thing. Then Karen moved in next door. The house had been empty for about 6 months after the previous owners moved to Florida for retirement. Dave had gotten used to the quiet, so he was actually looking forward to having neighbors again. When the moving truck showed up on a Saturday morning, Dave made sure to introduce himself and even offered to help carry some boxes. That's just the kind of person he was. Always willing to lend a hand. Karen seemed nice enough at first glance. She was probably in her late 40s, well-dressed, and drove a shiny SUV that looked like it had never seen a speck of dirt. Her husband seemed like a quiet guy who mostly just nodded and smiled while Karen did most of the talking. They had a teenage daughter who Dave rarely saw, probably because she was always buried in her phone like most kids that age. Within the first week of Karen moving in, Dave started to notice some things that seemed a little off. Karen had very strong opinions about how the neighborhood should look, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. She mentioned to Dave that she thought Mr. Peterson's vegetable garden was unsightly and wondered if there were HOA rules about front yard landscaping. She complained that the young couple across the street parked their car wrong in their own driveway. She even had something to say about the color that another neighbor had painted their front door. Dave tried to be understanding. Moving to a new place was stressful, and maybe Karen was just the type of person who needed everything to be perfect. He figured she'd settle in after a few weeks and relax a little. Besides, her complaints weren't really his problem, and Dave had learned long ago that the best way to deal with difficult people was to just smile, nod, and keep his distance. But then Karen bought the golf cart. It wasn't just any golf cart. It was one of those fancy electric ones that looked more like a small car than a typical golf cart. The thing had custom paint, leather seats, a sound system, and probably cost more than Dave's first actual car. Karen was clearly proud of it, and made sure everyone in the neighborhood knew about all its special features. She'd drive it around the block to the mailbox, and even to the community pool that was less than a quarter-mile away. The golf cart came with a charging station that needed to be plugged into a regular electrical outlet. Karen had it installed in her garage, but Dave noticed that she often parked the cart outside instead of pulling it all the way into the garage to charge it. At first, he didn't think much of it. People park their cars outside all the time, and if Karen wanted to leave her expensive golf cart in the driveway, that was her choice. Dave first noticed the orange extension cord on a Tuesday morning when he was heading out to work. There was a bright orange cable running along the ground from somewhere near his property line over to Karen's driveway, where her golf cart was parked. The cord was thick and heavy-duty, definitely not the kind of cheap extension cord you'd buy for indoor use. Dave followed the cord with his eyes and felt his stomach drop when he realized where it was plugged in. Someone had run that extension cord through a gap in the fence between their properties and plugged it directly into the outlet on his shed. Dave stood there for a full minute, trying to process what he was seeing. Surely there had to be some mistake. Maybe Karen's husband had asked permission and Dave had somehow forgotten about it. Maybe they'd left a note that had blown away in the wind. Maybe this was some kind of misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a simple conversation. But deep down, Dave knew exactly what was happening. Karen had decided that his electrical outlet was more convenient than her own garage, so she'd simply helped herself to his electricity without bothering to ask. The audacity of it was almost impressive in its boldness. Who just decides to plug their personal vehicle into their neighbor's power supply without even mentioning it? Dave's first instinct was to march right over to Karen's house and demand an explanation, but he forced himself to calm down and think rationally. He'd always prided himself on being reasonable and giving people the benefit of the doubt. Maybe Karen genuinely didn't realize that what she was doing was wrong. Maybe she planned to ask permission but just hadn't gotten around to it yet. Maybe she intended to offer to pay for the electricity she was using. Dave decided to wait and see what happened. If the extension cord was gone by the time he got home from work, he'd assume it was a one-time thing and let it slide. If it was still there, he'd have a friendly conversation with Karen and politely ask her to use her own electricity. Simple as that. When Dave pulled into his driveway that evening, the orange cord was still there, still connected to his outlet, still charging Karen's golf cart with his electricity. But now there was something else that made his blood pressure spike. Karen had added a second extension cord. This one was smaller and ran to what looked like a portable cooler sitting next to her pool. Apparently, helping herself to Dave's electricity had worked out so well that she decided to plug in even more stuff. Dave took a deep breath and walked over to Karen's front door. It was time for that friendly conversation. Dave knocked on Karen's front door 3 times before she finally answered. When she opened it, she had that fake smile that people put on when they know they're about to have an uncomfortable conversation. She was holding a glass of wine even though it was only 6:30 on a Tuesday, and Dave could hear her husband watching television somewhere in the background. "Oh, hi Dave," Karen said, like she was surprised to see him even though they were neighbors and he was standing on her front porch. "What can I do for you?" Dave had rehearsed what he was going to say during the walk from his driveway to her door. But now that he was face to face with Karen, the words felt awkward in his mouth. He wasn't used to confronting people, especially about something this weird. "Hey Karen, I hope you're settling in okay," Dave started, trying to keep his tone friendly. "I noticed there's an extension cord running from my shed over to your golf cart. I was just wondering if maybe there was some kind of emergency or something." Karen's expression didn't change, but Dave caught a quick flash of something in her eyes. Annoyance, maybe. Or the look people get when they're trying to decide how much trouble they're in. "Oh, that," Karen said with a little laugh that sounded forced. "Yeah, my garage outlet isn't working properly. I called an electrician, but you know how those guys are. They can't come out for like 2 weeks. I figured it wouldn't be a big deal to borrow a little electricity until I get it fixed. I hope that's okay." The way Karen said it made Dave feel like he was being unreasonable for even bringing it up. She made it sound like she was doing him a favor by only taking a little electricity, and like any decent neighbor would be happy to help out in her time of need. "Well, I mean, it would have been nice if you'd asked first," Dave said, trying to keep his voice level. "And I noticed there's a second cord running to what looks like a cooler by your pool." Karen waved her hand dismissively. That's just a little mini fridge for drinks when we're swimming. It barely uses any power at all. Don't worry, as soon as my garage outlet is fixed, I'll stop using yours. Dave wanted to point out that it didn't matter how much power she was using. The principle was that she was taking his electricity without permission. But Karen was already starting to close the door, clearly considering the conversation over. I really appreciate you being so understanding about this, Karen said, with that same fake smile. You're such a good neighbor. And just like that, the door was closed, leaving Dave standing on the porch feeling like he'd been dismissed by a school principal. He walked back to his house wondering if he'd handled that completely wrong. Maybe he should have been more direct. Maybe he should have just unplugged the extension cords himself instead of trying to be polite about it. Dave figured the conversation had gone well enough. Karen had explained the situation, promised it was temporary, and seemed to understand that she should have asked first. He decided to give her the benefit of the doubt and see if she kept her word about getting her garage outlet fixed. A week went by, and the orange extension cord was still there every morning when Dave left for work and every evening when he came home. The golf cart charged every night and the mini fridge by the pool hummed away continuously. Dave started to feel stupid for believing Karen's story about the broken garage outlet. He'd seen her husband working in their garage over the weekend, using power tools that were clearly plugged into a working outlet. But Dave tried to be patient. Maybe the electrician really was backed up. Maybe it was taking longer than expected to get the parts needed for the repair. Maybe Karen was just embarrassed about the whole situation and didn't want to bother Dave with updates. Then Dave got his electricity bill. He opened the envelope while eating breakfast, expecting to see his usual amount of around $85. Instead, the bill was for $137. Dave read it twice, thinking there had to be some mistake. He'd been extra careful about turning off lights and keeping the air conditioning at a reasonable temperature. There was no reason his bill should have jumped by more than $50. Dave spent his lunch break that day calling the electric company to ask about the increase. The customer service representative explained that his usage had gone up significantly over the past month, especially during overnight hours. She suggested that Dave might have an appliance that was malfunctioning or drawing more power than usual. After hanging up the phone, Dave sat in his car in the work parking lot and felt his jaw clench. He knew exactly what was causing his increased electric usage, and it wasn't a malfunctioning appliance. It was his neighbor's golf cart and mini fridge running off his power 24 hours a day. When Dave got home that evening, he was determined to have another conversation with Karen, this time about her paying for the electricity she'd been using. But as he pulled into his driveway, he noticed something that made his blood pressure spike even higher. There was a third extension cord. This one was running from his outlet to Karen's backyard, where she'd set up some kind of elaborate outdoor lighting system around her pool area. String lights were draped between trees, accent lights were highlighting her landscaping, and there was even a light inside the pool itself that made the water glow blue. It looked like something you'd see at a fancy resort, and it was all running off Dave's electricity. Dave didn't even bother going inside his house first. He marched straight over to Karen's front door and knocked hard enough that the sound echoed. This time, Karen took even longer to answer, and when she finally opened the door, she didn't bother with the fake smile. "Dave, what's wrong?" Karen asked, but her tone suggested she already knew why he was there. "What's wrong is that my electric bill went up by $50 last month because you've been charging your golf cart and running your pool equipment off my power," Dave said, his voice sharper than he'd intended. "And now I see you've added even more lights to the mix." Karen crossed her arms and leaned against her doorframe. "Look, Dave, I told you I'd pay you back when my outlet gets fixed. You don't need to get all worked up about a few dollars." A few dollars? Dave couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Karen, you've been stealing my electricity for over a month. That's not borrowing, that's theft." "Stealing is a pretty strong word," Karen said, her voice getting colder. "I'm your neighbor, not some criminal. And frankly, I'm a little hurt that you're making such a big deal out of this. I thought we were friends." Dave felt like he was losing his mind. How was Karen managing to make him feel like the bad guy in this situation? She was the one taking his electricity without permission, running up his bills and now acting like he was being unreasonable for complaining about it. "Karen, I need you to unplug all those extension cords tonight," Dave said, trying to keep his voice calm. "If your garage outlet is really broken, you can run a cord from inside your house, but you can't keep using my electricity." Karen's expression changed completely. The fake friendliness disappeared, replaced by a look that Dave had never seen from a neighbor before. It was the look of someone who was used to getting their way and didn't appreciate being told no. "You know what, Dave? I'm really disappointed in you," Karen said, shaking her head. "When I moved here, people told me this was a nice neighborhood, with good people who looked out for each other. But here you are nickel and diming me over a tiny bit of electricity. What's next? Are you going to charge me for walking on the grass near your property line?" Dave stood there speechless as Karen continued her lecture. A real man would want to help his neighbors, especially a woman who's trying to make her new home nice, Karen said. "But I guess some people are just too selfish to understand what being neighborly means. Don't worry, though, I'm not going to let your petty attitude ruin my enjoyment of my own property." Before Dave could respond, Karen stepped back inside and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Dave stood on her porch for a full minute, trying to process what had just happened. Somehow, in Karen's twisted logic, he was the villain in this story for objecting to her stealing his electricity. Dave walked back to his house feeling more frustrated than he'd ever been with another human being. As he looked out his kitchen window at the orange extension cord snaking across his property line, he realized that Karen had no intention of stopping. She'd made it clear that she considered his objections unreasonable and his property fair game for her use. That night, Dave lay in bed listening to the hum of Karen's pool equipment running off his electricity and wondered what kind of person he was dealing with. One thing was becoming crystal clear. Reasonable conversation wasn't going to solve this problem. Dave spent the next morning at work completely distracted. He kept replaying the conversation with Karen in his head, getting more frustrated each time he thought about how she'd turned the whole situation around to make him look like the bad guy. His co-workers noticed he was off his game, but Dave didn't feel like explaining that his neighbor was stealing his electricity and somehow making him feel guilty about complaining. During his lunch break, Dave decided to try a different approach. Maybe Karen's husband would be more reasonable. He'd seemed like a nice enough guy during their brief introduction when they first moved in, and Dave had noticed him doing yard work and maintenance around their house. Surely another homeowner would understand the principle of asking before using someone else's utilities. When Dave got home that evening, he saw Karen's husband working in their garage. The man was using what looked like a table saw, which was definitely plugged into an electrical outlet. Dave made a mental note of that detail. So much for Karen's story about their garage outlet being broken. Dave walked over and introduced himself again, since they'd only met briefly during the move-in chaos. Karen's husband, who went by Rick, seemed friendly enough. He wiped the sawdust off his hands and shook Dave's hand with a firm grip. "Hey, good to see you again," Rick said. "How are you liking the neighborhood?" "It's great, actually," Dave replied. "Listen, I was hoping I could talk to you about something. It's a little awkward, but Karen's been using my electrical outlet to charge her golf cart and run some other equipment. I tried talking to her about it, but I think there might have been some miscommunication." Dave watched Rick's face carefully as he explained the situation. He could see the man's expression change from friendly interest to what looked like embarrassment and maybe a little bit of resignation. Rick glanced toward his house, then back at Dave, and let out a long sigh. "Yeah, I was wondering when this would come up," Rick said quietly. "I told Karen she should ask you first, but she said it would only be for a few days until we got our setup sorted out. That was over a month ago." "So your garage outlet works fine?" Dave asked, gesturing toward the power tools. Rick nodded, looking uncomfortable. "Yeah, it works fine. Karen just thinks it's more convenient to charge the cart outside instead of pulling it into the garage every night. She says it's easier." Dave felt a mix of relief and frustration. Relief that Rick seemed to understand the problem, but frustration that Karen had been lying about the broken outlet from the beginning. "Look, I don't want to cause problems between you and your wife," Dave said carefully. "But I'm getting charged for all that electricity she's using, and frankly, I think it's wrong to take someone's power without asking. Rick rubbed the back of his neck and looked genuinely sorry. You're absolutely right, and I apologize. I should have put my foot down about this from the beginning. Let me talk to Karen tonight and get this sorted out. Dave left that conversation, feeling hopeful for the first time in weeks. Rick seemed like a reasonable person who understood basic neighborly courtesy. Surely he could convince Karen to stop using Dave's electricity, and maybe even offer to pay for what she'd already used. The next morning, Dave was disappointed, but not entirely surprised to see all 3 extension cords still running from his outlet to Karen's various devices. The golf cart was charging, the pool lights were on, and the mini fridge was humming away. Either Rick hadn't talked to Karen or the conversation hadn't gone the way Dave had hoped. That evening, Dave saw Rick working in his garage again and decided to check in. When he walked over, Rick looked up from his workbench with an expression that was part embarrassment and part defeat. I talked to her, Rick said before Dave could even ask. She says you're being unreasonable and the good neighbors should help each other out. She also said something about how you were rude to her and that she doesn't appreciate being accused of stealing. Dave felt his jaw clench. Rick, she is stealing. Taking someone's electricity without permission is theft, no matter how she wants to spin it. I know, Rick said quietly. Trust me, I know, but Karen can be difficult when she doesn't get her way. I've learned to pick my battles, and honestly, this isn't a hill I'm prepared to die on. Dave stared at Rick, trying to process what he'd just heard. This grown man was basically telling him that he was afraid to stand up to his own wife about something that was clearly wrong. It was both sad and infuriating at the same time. So what am I supposed to do? Dave asked. Just let her keep stealing my electricity forever? Rick shrugged helplessly. Maybe you could put a lock on your outlet or something? I'm sorry, Dave. I really am. But I have to live with her. And you don't. Dave walked away from that conversation, feeling more alone than ever. If Karen's own husband wouldn't stand up to her, what chance did Dave have of resolving this through normal means? Over the next few days, Dave tried to think of other options. He remembered that their neighborhood had a homeowners association, so he dug through his paperwork until he found the contact information for the HOA president. Maybe there were rules about property disputes or utility theft that could help him. Dave called the HOA president, a woman who lived a few streets over and had been in the neighborhood for almost 20 years. He explained the situation as objectively as possible, focusing on the facts rather than his personal frustration with Karen's attitude. That's definitely not okay, the HOA president said after hearing Dave's story. But unfortunately, utility disputes between individual homeowners aren't something the HOA typically gets involved in. Our rules mostly cover things like lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and community area usage. So there's nothing you can do? Dave asked. I can document your complaint in case it becomes a bigger issue down the road, she offered. But for now, this sounds like something you'll need to work out directly with your neighbor, or possibly involve local authorities if you think it's theft. Dave thanked her for her time, but hung up feeling more frustrated than ever. It seemed like everyone he talked to acknowledged that Karen was in the wrong, but nobody was willing or able to actually do anything about it. Desperate for options, Dave decided to try one more approach. He would offer to pay for having a proper electrical outlet installed on Karen's side of their shared fence. It would cost him a few $100s, but maybe if he removed her excuse about convenience, she'd stop using his power. Dave researched local electricians and got quotes for installing a weatherproof outlet near Karen's property line. Then he wrote out a polite note explaining his offer and put it in Karen's mailbox. The note read, Karen, I've gotten quotes from electricians to install an outlet on your side of our fence for your golf cart charging. I'm willing to split the or cost 50-50 if you're interested. This would solve the convenience issue and prevent any further misunderstandings about electrical usage. Please let me know if you'd like to move forward with this solution. Dave thought this was a reasonable compromise. He'd be out a couple $100s, but it would end the conflict and restore peace to his daily life. He waited 3 days for Karen to respond to his note, checking his mailbox hopefully each evening after work. On the 4th day, Dave found his note crumpled up and thrown on his front lawn. That evening, As Dave was bringing in his garbage cans, Karen happened to be outside watering her plants. She looked over at him with that same fake smile she'd used during their first conversation. "Oh, Dave," she called out sweetly. "I got your little note about the electrical work." Dave walked over to the fence between their properties, hoping she was ready to accept his offer. "I have to say I'm a little insulted," Karen continued. "The way you wrote that note made it sound like I'm some kind of burden on you. For your information, I don't need you to solve my problems for me. My current arrangement works just fine, Bea." Couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Karen, it's not your arrangement, it's my electricity. You're using my power without my permission." Karen turned off her hose and faced him directly. "You know what I think? I think you're just looking for attention. You're probably lonely living in that big house all by yourself, and you figured you could make friends by creating drama with your neighbors." "That's ridiculous," Dave said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "Is it?" Karen asked. "Because it seems to me like you're making a mountain out of a molehill. We're talking about maybe $5 worth of electricity per month. What kind of person makes their neighbor feel unwelcome over $5? Dave wanted to point out that his bill had gone up by $50, not $5, but he could see that Karen wasn't interested in facts. She was more interested in making him feel like he was crazy for objecting to her behavior. "I'll tell you what," Karen said, her voice dripping with false generosity. "Since you're so worried about your precious electricity bill, I'll keep track of exactly how much power I use and pay you back someday. Will that make you feel better?" Before Dave could respond, Karen turned her hose back on and walked away, clearly considering the conversation over. Dave stood there watching her water her flowers with his stolen electricity, powering the pump that pressurized her water system. Because of course she'd added that to her collection of devices plugged into his outlet. Dave woke up on Saturday morning feeling more determined than he had in weeks. He'd spent the entire night thinking about Karen's smug attitude and her complete disregard for his property rights. Every reasonable approach had failed, and it was clear that Karen had no intention of changing her behavior. If anything, she seemed to be getting worse, adding more devices to his electrical outlet like she was testing to see how much she could get away with. Dave made himself a cup of coffee and sat on his back porch, looking out at the orange extension cords that had become a permanent fixture in his view. As he sipped his coffee, he found himself remembering a conversation he'd had with his grandfather years ago. The old man had been a farmer his whole life, and he'd always said that some problems required creative solutions. "Sometimes, Davy," his grandfather had told him, "you can't reason with a person who's determined to be unreasonable, but you can sure make them think twice about their choices." Dave spent the morning cleaning out his garage, partly to keep himself busy and partly because he was looking for something specific. He remembered storing some old farming equipment when he'd helped clean out his grandfather's barn after the old man passed away 5 years earlier. Most of it was junk that Dave had kept for sentimental reasons, but he had a feeling there might be something useful in those boxes. Sure enough, buried under some rusty hand tools and a collection of old fence posts, Dave found exactly what he was looking for. It was an electric fence controller, the kind farmers use to keep livestock from wandering off their property. The device was probably 20 years old, but looked like it had barely been used. Dave's grandfather had bought it when he was thinking about getting a few cattle, but he'd changed his mind and stuck with crops instead. Dave carried the controller into his house and plugged it into the wall to see if it still worked. A small green light came on, and Dave could hear a faint clicking sound every few seconds. He remembered his grandfather explaining how these devices worked. They sent out a brief electrical pulse that was strong enough to get an animal's attention, but not strong enough to cause any real harm. "It's not about hurting them," his grandfather had explained. "It's about teaching them to respect boundaries." Dave spent the rest of Saturday researching electric fence controllers online. He wanted to make sure he understood exactly how they worked and what kind of shock they delivered. What he found was reassuring. These devices were designed to be safe. The shock they delivered was startling and unpleasant, but it wasn't dangerous. Farmers used them around all kinds of animals, from horses to sheep to cattle, without any safety concerns. Dave also looked up the legal aspects of using such a device on his own property. As far as he could tell, He had every right to protect his electrical outlets from unauthorized use. The controller would only affect someone who was actively trying to plug something into his outlet without permission. Anyone who had legitimate business with his electrical system, like a repair person he'd hired, would know to ask first. On Sunday morning, Dave drove to the hardware store to buy the supplies he'd need for his plan. He purchased some heavy-duty electrical wire, a few connectors, and a weatherproof junction box. The clerk who helped him was an older man who clearly knew his way around electrical work. "Building a fence?" the clerk asked, noticing the type of wire Dave was buying. "Something like that," Dave replied. "Just need to keep some unwanted visitors away from my property." The clerk nodded knowingly. "These electric fence setups work real well for that. Just make sure you follow the instructions and don't try to soup it up or anything. The factory settings are plenty strong enough to get your point across." Dave spent Sunday afternoon carefully planning his installation. He didn't want to do anything that would damage his shed or create a safety hazard. The electric fence controller would be mounted inside his shed, connected to the outdoor outlet through a switch that Dave could control from inside. When the switch was in the normal position, the outlet would work like any regular electrical outlet. But when Dave flipped the switch to the other position, anyone trying to plug something in would get a memorable surprise. Dave had to admit he was enjoying the engineering challenge of the project. It had been years since he'd done any serious electrical work, and he found himself getting absorbed in the details of making everything work properly. He drew diagrams, double-checked his wiring plans, and made sure he understood every aspect of the system before he started the actual installation. On Monday evening, Dave began the installation. He worked carefully, taking his time to make sure every connection was secure and properly insulated. The last thing he wanted was to create a real safety hazard while trying to solve his Karen problem. Dave had always believed in doing things right, even when he was doing something as unconventional as wiring an electric fence controller to his outdoor outlet. The trickiest part was installing the switch that would let him control whether the outlet delivered normal power or the electric fence pulse. Dave mounted it inside his shed where it wouldn't be visible from outside, but where he could easily access it. He labeled the switch positions clearly, normal and fence, so he wouldn't accidentally forget which setting he was using. By Tuesday evening, Dave's system was complete and ready for testing. He'd been careful to work on it only when Karen wasn't around, doing most of the installation after dark or early in the morning when she was less likely to be outside. The orange extension cords were still there, still plugged into his outlet, still powering Karen's golf cart and pool equipment. Dave tested his system carefully, using an old lamp that he didn't care about in case something went wrong. With the switch in the normal position, the lamp worked perfectly. When he flipped the switch to fence and touched the outlet with an insulated screwdriver, he could see the small spark and hear the clicking sound of the controller. Everything was working exactly as planned. For his final test, Dave decided to try the electric fence pulse on himself. He wanted to know exactly what Karen would experience so he could be confident that it was unpleasant, but not dangerous. Dave set the controller to its lowest setting and briefly touched the outlet with his finger. The shock was definitely attention-getting. It felt like a sharp pinch that made his whole arm tingle for a few seconds. It was startling and uncomfortable, but it wasn't painful in the way that touching a live wire would be. Dave could see why farmers use these devices. They were effective without being cruel. Dave spent Wednesday evening watching Karen's routine from his kitchen window. She usually plugged in her golf cart around 8 o'clock each night, after she finished whatever she was doing in her backyard. Karen had developed a very predictable pattern. She'd wheel the golf cart out of her garage, park it in her driveway, and then walk over to Dave's fence line to plug in the extension cord. Thursday morning, Dave flipped his switch to the fence position before leaving for work. He felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation as he drove to his job. Part of him wondered if he was going too far, but then he remembered Karen's smug attitude and her complete refusal to respect his property rights. She'd had plenty of chances to do the right thing, and she'd chosen to escalate the situation instead. Dave had trouble concentrating at work that day. He kept checking the clock, wondering when Karen would discover his surprise. Would she try to plug in her golf cart during the day, Or would she wait until evening like usual? Would she figure out immediately what had happened, or would she think there was something wrong with her equipment? Dave's phone didn't ring with angry calls from Karen, which he took as a sign that she hadn't discovered the electric fence yet. When he got home from work, he could see her golf cart sitting in her garage instead of her driveway, which was unusual. The extension cords were still there, but they weren't plugged into anything. Dave went inside and flipped his switch back to the normal position, just in case Karen tried to plug something in while he was watching. He didn't want to give away his secret before Karen had a chance to learn her lesson properly. That evening, Dave positioned himself at his kitchen window with a cup of coffee and waited. Right on schedule, Karen appeared in her driveway around 8 o'clock. She wheeled her golf cart out of the garage and parked it in its usual spot. Then she walked over to the fence line, picked up the extension cord and headed toward Dave's outlet. Dave flipped his switch to fence and held his breath. Karen was about to get exactly what she deserved for months of stealing his electricity and treating his property like her personal power source. Dave couldn't help but smile as he watched Karen reach for his outlet, completely unaware that her days of free electricity were about to come to a very shocking end. Dave stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching Karen walk toward his shed with that same entitled confidence she'd shown for months. She had no idea that her free ride was about to come to an abrupt and shocking end. Dave's heart was beating faster than usual as he watched her bend down to pick up the orange extension cord. Karen moved with the casual ease of someone who had done this routine hundreds of times before. She didn't even glance toward Dave's house or show any sign that she thought what she was doing might be wrong. In her mind, Dave's electrical outlet had apparently become her personal charging station, and she had every right to use it whenever she pleased. Dave watched as Karen straightened up, extension cord in hand, and took the 3 steps to his outdoor outlet. She crouched down slightly and reached toward the outlet with the plug. Dave held his breath and tightened his grip on his coffee mug. The moment Karen's fingers touched the outlet, everything changed. The sharp crack of the electric fence controller was audible even through Dave's closed kitchen window. Karen let out a shriek that probably woke up half the neighborhood and jerked backward so violently that she lost her balance and fell onto her backside. The extension cord went flying, landing several feet away from the outlet. Dave had to press his lips together to keep from laughing out loud as he watched Karen scramble to her feet, shaking her right hand and staring at the outlet like it had personally betrayed her. She was clearly trying to figure out what had just happened, looking back and forth between the outlet and the extension cord like she couldn't believe what she'd just experienced. For a moment, Karen just stood there, clearly stunned. Then Dave watched her face change as the shock wore off and anger took its place. Even from his kitchen window, Dave could see that Karen was furious. She started pacing back and forth along the fence line, gesturing wildly and clearly talking to herself, though Dave couldn't hear what she was saying. After about 5 minutes of pacing and muttering, Karen stormed back into her house. Dave figured that was the end of the evening's entertainment, but he was wrong. Less than 10 minutes later, Karen came marching back outside, this time carrying what looked like a pair of rubber kitchen gloves and a wooden spoon. Dave couldn't believe what he was seeing. Karen was actually going to try again, this time with makeshift protection. She put on the rubber gloves and used the wooden spoon to try to manipulate the extension cord plug toward the outlet. Dave had to give her credit for creativity, even if he questioned her common sense. Unfortunately for Karen, her wooden spoon technique wasn't precise enough to actually get the plug into the outlet. After several minutes of frustrated poking and prodding, she gave up and stormed back into her house again. Dave waited to see if she'd make a third attempt, but apparently, Karen had decided that her golf cart could wait until tomorrow to be charged. Dave went to bed that night feeling more satisfied than he had in months. Finally, after weeks of being stolen from and made to feel like he was the unreasonable one, justice had been served. He fell asleep easily, no longer bothered by the sound of Karen's pool equipment running off his electricity because for the first time in ages, it wasn't. The next morning, Dave left for work in an excellent mood. As he backed out of his driveway, he noticed that Karen's golf cart was still sitting in her driveway, uncharged and unused. The extension cords were coiled up in a pile near her fence, apparently abandoned after last night's shocking discovery. Dave was about halfway through his workday when his cell phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered anyway. "Is this Dave Henderson?" a woman's voice asked. She sounded angry and official. "Yes, this is Dave. This is Karen Wilson from next door. I need to talk to you about what you did to your electrical outlet." Dave had been expecting this call, but hearing Karen's furious voice still made his stomach clench slightly. "What about my electrical outlet, Karen?" "Don't play dumb with me," Karen snapped. "You booby-trapped it or something. I got shocked last night trying to plug in my extension cord." Dave took a deep breath and reminded himself that he had every right to protect his own property. "Karen, you got shocked because you were trying to plug something into my electrical outlet without my permission. What you've been doing is called theft of services." "Theft?" Karen's voice went up an octave. "I told you I was borrowing a little electricity until my outlet got fixed. That's not theft." "Karen, it's been over 2 months and your outlet was never broken," Dave said calmly. "I've seen your husband using power tools in your garage. You've been stealing my electricity to charge your golf cart, run your pool equipment, and power your outdoor lights. That's theft, and you know it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Karen spoke again, her voice was even angrier than before. "I don't care what you want to call it. What you did is dangerous and probably illegal. I could have been seriously hurt by whatever you rigged up over there." Dave felt his own anger rising. Even after getting caught red-handed stealing his electricity, Karen was still trying to make herself the victim. "Karen, what I installed is a standard livestock deterrent system. It's designed to be startling but completely safe. Farmers use them around animals all the time. The only way you would have encountered it is if you were trying to use my electrical outlet without permission." "I'm calling the police," Karen threatened. "What you did is assault or booby-trapping or something. You can't just electrocute people." "Go ahead and call them," Dave said, surprising himself with how calm he sounded. "When they get there, make sure you explain to them why you were trying to plug something into your neighbor's electrical outlet without permission. I'm sure they'll be very interested in that part of the story." Karen hung up without another word, leaving Dave sitting at his desk wondering if she would actually follow through on her threat to call the police. Part of him hoped she would. He'd done his research and he was confident that he hadn't broken any laws by protecting his own property from theft. Dave didn't have to wait long to find out. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, he got a call from a police officer asking if he could come home to discuss a complaint from his neighbor. Dave told his boss he had a family emergency and left work early. When Dave pulled into his driveway, there was a police cruiser parked on the street and 2 officers standing in his front yard talking to Karen. One was an older officer who looked like he'd seen everything, and the other was a younger woman who was taking notes. Karen was gesticulating wildly and clearly giving them her version of events. Dave walked over and introduced himself to the officers. The older officer, whose name tag read Martinez, looked like he was trying not to smile. "Mr. Henderson, we're here about a complaint from your neighbor regarding an electrical device on your property," Officer Martinez said. "She claims you've set up some kind of trap that shocked her last night." "That's right," Dave said. "I installed a livestock deterrent system to protect my electrical outlet from unauthorized use. It's the same type of device farmers use to keep animals away from certain areas." "Unauthorized use?" the younger officer asked. Dave explained the whole situation, starting with how he'd discovered Karen using his electricity and going through all his attempts to resolve the issue peacefully. He told them about Karen's lies regarding her broken outlet, her refusal to stop using his power, and her dismissive attitude when he'd tried to address the problem. Officer Martinez listened patiently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Dave finished his story, the officer turned to Karen. "Ma'am, is it true that you've been plugging your equipment into Mr. Henderson's electrical outlet without his permission?" Karen's face turned red. "It's just a little bit of electricity. He's being completely unreasonable about the whole thing." "But you didn't have his permission to use his electrical service?" Officer Martinez pressed. "Well, no, but, ma'am, that's theft of services," the officer said matter-of-factly. "Mr. Henderson has every right to protect his property from unauthorized use. The device he installed is legal and commonly used for property protection." Dave watched Karen's expression change from angry confidence to shocked disbelief. Apparently, she'd expected the police to take her side and force Dave to remove his electric fence controller. But he could have seriously hurt me, Karen protested. The younger officer looked up from her notes. Ma'am, livestock deterrent systems are designed to be safe. They deliver a mild shock that's startling but not harmful. The only way you would have encountered it is if you were attempting to access Mr. Henderson's electrical outlet without permission. Officer Martinez turned back to Dave. Mr. Henderson, I'm going to recommend that you post a small warning sign near your outlet, just so there's no question about people being aware of the deterrent system. But other than that, you're well within your rights to protect your property this way. What about her stealing my electricity for the past 2 months? Dave asked. Isn't that something you can do something about? Officer Martinez looked at Karen, who was now standing with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a tight line. Technically, yes, theft of services is a misdemeanor offense, he said. But given that this appears to be a neighbor dispute that's now been resolved, I'd recommend you folks just move forward from here.